February 22, 2002. Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. A team of forensic investigators stands at the entrance of a dilapidated pig farm, their faces pale beneath their protective gear. What they've discovered in the soil samples will redefine the boundaries of human depravity. Detective Don Adam surveys the muddy terrain of 953 Dominion Avenue. The analysis has just come back from the lab, human DNA, not from one victim, not from 5. Preliminary tests suggest remains from dozens of women are scattered across this property, mixed with animal bones, buried in the mud, ground into the very earth itself. The owner of this farm, Robert William Pickton, had been raising pigs here for decades. He'd sold the meat to local markets. He'd hosted parties where hundreds of people unknowingly walked over graves, and for nearly 2 decades he'd been feeding his victims to his livestock, creating a disposal method so horrific that even seasoned homicide detectives would need therapy to process what they were about to uncover. The search would take nearly 2 years. They would sift through 383,000 cubic yards of soil. They would find DNA from 33 missing women. But the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the truth about Robert Pickton's farm of horror, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into history's darkest chapters. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's enter one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in Canadian history. To understand how Robert Pickton operated undetected for so long, you must first understand Vancouver in the 1980s and 1990s. The city was undergoing rapid transformation. Expo 86 had put Vancouver on the world stage, bringing tourists and investment. The skyline glittered with new construction, real estate values soared, but beneath this polished surface festered a wound that civic leaders preferred to ignore. Vancouver's downtown eastside had become ground zero for Canada's opioid crisis before the term even existed. A 6-block radius surrounding Main and Hastings streets housed the highest concentration of drug users, sex workers, and homeless individuals in the country. Addiction, poverty, and desperation created a perfect hunting ground for predators. The women who worked these streets were society's invisible. Many struggled with addiction. Most had survived childhood trauma. Some were Indigenous women already marginalized by systemic racism. When they disappeared, their absences barely registered. No Amber Alerts, no massive search parties. Often, no missing persons reports at all. Robert William Pickton was born October 24, 1949, in Port Coquitlam, a working-class suburb 30 kilometers east of Vancouver. His childhood was isolated and troubled. The Pickton family operated a pig farm on 17 acres of property that would eventually be worth millions as suburban sprawl encroached. Neighbors described the farm as chaotic and filthy. The Pickton brothers, Robert and David, were considered odd by local standards. Robert was quiet, socially awkward, and seemed to have difficulty with basic hygiene. He dropped out of school and remained on the farm, working with the pigs that would later become instrumental in his crimes. By the 1990s, the Pickton brothers had stopped actively farming but still kept pigs on the property. The farm had become something else entirely. Robert hosted massive parties and raves in the barn, events that could draw 500 people. He called these gatherings the Piggy Palace Good Times Society. Officially registered as a charity for entertainment and recreation, the setup was perfect. The property was large and isolated. The parties provided cover for unusual comings and goings. The remaining pigs offered a disposal method that would prove devastatingly effective, and the downtown east side offered an endless supply of victims that few would miss. Escalating incidents, the vanishing women. The disappearances began earlier than anyone realized. Looking back, investigators would eventually connect Pickton to deaths dating back to 1983. But the pattern didn't become undeniable until the mid-1990s, when women began vanishing at an accelerating rate. 1. Kathleen Watley, 26 years old, was last seen in the downtown east side. She never returned to the single-room occupancy hotel where she lived. Her family filed a missing persons report, but the investigation went nowhere. 2. Angela Jardine, 27, disappeared after telling friends she was going to see a John who owned a farm outside the city. The details seemed too vague to pursue. 3. Catherine Gonzalez, 33, vanished completely. Then Catherine Knight, 26. Then Dorothy Spence, 36. The pace was increasing, but the pattern remained invisible to authorities focused on individual cases rather than the bigger picture. The Vancouver Police Department's response was tepid at best, criminally negligent at worst. When families reported women missing, officers often suggested they'd simply moved to another city or were on a drug binge. The institutional bias was clear. These women's lives didn't merit the same urgency as missing persons from wealthier neighborhoods. But in the downtown East Side community itself, people were noticing. Sex workers began comparing notes. Friends were disappearing. Women they saw daily simply vanished, never to be heard from again. They started to whisper about a customer who drove a pickup truck, who offered too much money, who wanted to take them to a farm. Wayne Leng, a community advocate, began tracking the disappearances on his own. By 1998, he'd compiled a list of 40 missing women, all from the same small geographic area, all sharing similar lifestyles. The statistical improbability was staggering, yet police remained skeptical about a serial predator. The unofficial word on the street was explicit: don't get in the truck, don't go to the farm. But desperation is a powerful force, and the money Pickton offered was often too much to refuse, especially for someone in the grip of addiction. 1997 became the deadliest year yet. Cindy Felix, 34. Marnie Frey, 24. Helen Hallmark, 31. Jacqueline McDonnell, 23. 4 women in 1 year from the same neighborhood. Still, police publicly denied the existence of a serial killer. One woman did escape. In March 1997, a sex worker whom we'll call Sandra was taken to the Pickton farm. She later testified that Pickton handcuffed her and attacked her with a knife. During the struggle, she managed to grab the weapon and stab Pickton, then fled the property covered in blood, both his and hers. She reported the attack to police. Officers went to the farm and found Pickton being treated for stab wounds. He told them it was a misunderstanding. The woman was a drug user with credibility issues. Incredibly, charges were eventually stayed. The Crown cited the victim's lifestyle and drug use as making the case unlikely to succeed at trial. Pickton remained free. The killings continued. 1. Diane Rock, 34. Carrie Koski, 39. Andrea Borhaven, 25. By now, families of the missing women were organizing, demanding police action, pleading with media to cover the story. Still, authorities hesitated to use the term serial killer. The institutional failure was systematic and complete. The new millennium brought no relief. If anything, the disappearances accelerated. In 1999 and 2000, investigators would later determine that at least 15 women who visited the Pickton farm never left alive. Pickton had refined his method. He would cruise the downtown East Side in his truck, offering women money for sex or simply asking if they wanted to party. Once at the farm, he'd take them to his trailer or the workshop. What happened in those spaces would emerge only through forensic evidence and the testimony of the few who survived encounters with him. The disposal method was horrifically efficient. Pickton butchered his victims using the same tools and techniques he'd learned from processing pigs. He fed remains to the animals, which consumed flesh, organs, and bone. What the pigs didn't eat, he buried in the pig pen, where the DNA would degrade in the manure-rich soil. Some remains he mixed with pork and sent to a rendering plant, where they were processed into materials for cosmetics, pet food, and other products. It was a disposal method that turned victims into literally nothing. Into products consumed by an unsuspecting public. Into components of everyday items. The psychological horror of this realization would haunt investigators for years. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button to help others discover these important true crime investigations. Share this with someone who appreciates deep dives into criminal psychology. The discovery that finally exposed Pickton's crimes is coming next, and you won't believe how close he came to getting away with it all. By 2001, the pressure on Vancouver police had become impossible to ignore. Families of missing women had organized into an advocacy group. Media coverage was finally picking up. The missing persons count now exceeded 50 women from the same small area. Even the most skeptical detective couldn't deny the pattern any longer. In early 2001, the Vancouver Police Department finally formed a task force specifically to investigate the missing women. They called it Project Even-Handed, and it brought together resources from multiple jurisdictions. One name kept appearing in their investigation: Robert Pickton. Multiple witnesses had mentioned the pig farm. Several women reported being taken there. The 1997 assault case was reopened and scrutinized. Undercover operations began monitoring Pickton's movements. Slowly, investigators built their case, but the break came from an unexpected direction. In January 2002, police received a tip that illegal firearms were being stored at the Pickton property. It was the probable cause they needed. On February 5, 2002, officers executed a search warrant, ostensibly looking for weapons violations. What they would find would launch one of the largest forensic investigations in Canadian history. Detective Don Adam was among the first officers to thoroughly search the property. In Pickton's trailer, they found personal items belonging to missing women. Identification cards, jewelry, clothing. In the slaughterhouse workshop, they found bloodstains that would later test positive for human DNA from multiple victims. Then came the freezer. Inside a freezer unit, investigators found severed hands and feet, in plastic bags, labeled and stored as if they were cuts of meat intended for later use. The forensic team documented everything with clinical precision, their hands steady even as the magnitude of what they were processing threatened to overwhelm them. In the workshop, they found a dildo with a loaded .22 caliber handgun attached to it, both items covered in blood. Later analysis would show DNA from 2 victims, Diane Rock and Mona Wilson, on these items. The psychological profile this suggested was almost incomprehensible in its sadism. February 22, 2002, brought the soil analysis results that confirmed the worst fears. Multiple samples from the pig pen and surrounding areas contained human DNA from different individuals. The property wasn't just a crime scene. It was a mass grave. Robert Pickton was arrested and charged initially with 2 counts of first-degree murder. As the investigation expanded, the charges would grow to 27 counts, though authorities suspected the true victim count was much higher. The excavation of the property began in earnest. Anthropology teams from universities across Canada volunteered. Forensic archaeologists used ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dogs, and painstaking manual excavation. They worked in protective suits, sifting through pig waste, contaminated soil, and decomposed organic matter. The conditions were horrific. The smell was overpowering even through respirators. The psychological toll on investigators was severe. Many would later require counseling. Some would leave law enforcement entirely, unable to process what they'd witnessed. The search extended to the Port Coquitlam rendering plant where Pickton had sent material from the farm. Investigators learned that from 1997 to 2001, Pickton had delivered mixed loads of animal and human remains to the facility. Once processed, this material had entered the commercial supply chain. The implications were staggering. People across Western Canada had potentially been exposed to products containing human remains. The rendering plant immediately ceased operations. A massive recall effort began, though authorities couldn't publicly specify why without causing mass panic. In Pickton's trailer, police found a book called Purgatory's Peak, with entries written in the margins. One entry was particularly chilling. "I was going to do one more, make it an even 50. Investigators took this as a confession that Pickton had killed 49 women and was planning his 50th victim when he was arrested. DNA evidence eventually linked Pickton definitively to 33 victims, though the official victim count remained disputed. The trial would focus on 6 murders where evidence was strongest: Marnie Frey, Georgina Papin, Brenda Wolfe, Andrea Josbury, Serena Abotsway, and Mona Wilson. Each name represented a life stolen. A daughter, sister, mother, friend who'd been reduced to forensic evidence recovered from pig pens and rendering facilities. Investigation. The prosecution of Robert Pickton would become one of the longest and most complex trials in Canadian history. It began on January 30, 2006, in New Westminster Supreme Court. The proceedings would last nearly 2 years and cost taxpayers an estimated $70 million. The defense strategy was to cast doubt on the forensic evidence and suggest that David Pickton, Robert's brother, or others who frequented the farm might be responsible. The property had hosted so many people through the Piggy Palace parties that the defense argued contamination was inevitable, but the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts testified about DNA recovery techniques. Anthropologists explained how they'd identified human remains among animal bones. The jury heard testimony about the freezer contents, the belongings of missing women, the disturbing items found in the workshop. Most damning was a conversation recorded while Pickton was in custody. Unaware he was being monitored, Pickton spoke to an undercover officer placed in his cell. He confessed to killing 49 women and expressed frustration that he hadn't reached 50. He described his methods, his motivations, and showed no remorse. On December 9, 2007, the jury reached its verdict: guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. Not first degree, which requires premeditation, but second degree. The distinction meant Pickton would be eligible for parole after 25 years, rather than having no possibility of parole. The verdict devastated families. Second-degree murder suggested crimes of passion rather than the calculated systematic hunting and killing that had clearly occurred. The Crown had proven premeditation, yet the jury delivered the lesser conviction. Legal experts speculated the jury was overwhelmed by the horror and couldn't bring themselves to the first-degree verdict that would mean truly confronting what Pickton had done. Judge James Williams sentenced Pickton to life imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 25 years, the maximum available for second-degree murder. Pickton showed no emotion as the sentence was read. The Crown initially planned to try Pickton on the remaining 20 counts of first-degree murder. However, in August 2010, they decided to stay the charges. The argument was that Pickton was already serving the maximum sentence possible under Canadian law. Further trials would cost millions and traumatize families again, without changing the outcome. For the families of the other 27 suspected victims, this decision meant no day in court, no official acknowledgement. Their loved ones' names would never be formally connected to their killer in a court of law. David Pickton was never charged with any crime, though the property was jointly owned. He eventually sold the land to a developer for millions of dollars, profiting from property made valuable by urban sprawl, the same land where so many women had died. The Vancouver Police Department faced intense scrutiny. An inquiry called the Missing Women Commission of Inquiry examined police failures. The findings were damning: systemic bias, inadequate resources for missing persons from marginalized communities, failure to recognize serial predation, and poor interagency communication. Particular criticism focused on the 1997 assault case. Had police taken that investigation seriously? Had the Crown proceeded with charges? Had Pickton been incarcerated then? At least 15 women would still be alive. The institutional failure had body count. Police leadership apologized publicly. Policy reforms were implemented. A monument to the missing women was planned. But for the families, no apology could return their daughters, sisters, mothers. One particularly painful discovery emerged during the investigation. Pig meat from the Pickton farm had been mixed with legitimate pork and distributed to the public. Some had even been donated to food banks and served to Vancouver's homeless population. The bitter irony was that the very community Pickton preyed upon had potentially consumed his victims. Pickton is currently incarcerated at Kent Institution, a maximum security prison in British Columbia. He has maintained a low profile, avoiding interviews and public statements. In May 2024, he was transferred to a medical facility after being assaulted by another inmate. He survived but sustained serious injuries. He will be eligible to apply for parole in 2032, when he is 82 years old. Given the nature of his crimes and public outrage, parole experts consider it extremely unlikely he will ever be released. Broader implications. The Pickton case exposed uncomfortable truths about how society values certain lives over others. The women who died were not anonymous statistics. They were human beings with families, with histories, with futures stolen from them. Yet their disappearances were ignored for years because of who they were and where they lived. Georgina Pupin, one of Pickton's confirmed victims, was a mother. Her children grew up without her, not knowing for years what had happened. Marnie Frey was a talented artist who'd survived childhood trauma and struggled with addiction. Andrea Josbury was trying to get clean, attending programs, fighting for a better life. Each woman had a story, but those stories were deemed less important by the institutions meant to protect them. The case sparked national conversation about the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls crisis. Many of Pickton's victims were Indigenous. Their cases fit a pattern seen across Canada: Indigenous women disappearing and dying at rates far exceeding their proportion of the population. With investigations receiving insufficient resources and attention, in 2016 the Canadian government launched a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, spurred in part by cases like Pickton's. The final report, released in 2019, called the pattern genocide and made hundreds of recommendations for systemic change. The Vancouver Police Department's handling of the case led to significant reforms in missing persons investigations. New protocols require earlier intervention when patterns emerge. Specialized units focus on vulnerable populations. Interagency communication improved. But these changes came too late for Pickton's victims. The case also revealed horrifying possibilities in modern food systems. The fact that human remains could enter commercial supply chains undetected raised questions about inspection, oversight, and traceability. Regulations tightened around rendering plants and animal processing facilities. Psychologically, Pickton represents a particular type of serial predator, the organized killer, who selects victims from marginalized populations specifically because they're less likely to be searched for. He understood systemic biases and exploited them. His victim selection wasn't random, it was calculated to minimize risk of detection. Forensic experts learned valuable lessons about evidence recovery in extreme decomposition conditions. The techniques developed during the Pickton excavation have since been applied to mass grave investigations, disaster recovery, and other serial killer cases. The scientific advancement came at an unbearable human cost. The rendering plant contamination raised philosophical questions about harm. People who unknowingly used products containing human remains suffered no physical injury, yet many experienced psychological trauma upon learning the truth. Where is the line between physical and psychological victimization? The legal system struggled to address this unprecedented situation. Communities around the farm property demanded it never be developed. Eventually, the land was sold and the structures demolished, but the soil itself remained contaminated with history. Urban legends grew about the property being haunted, about the pigs that remained being dangerous. The truth was disturbing enough without embellishment. For the families, closure remains elusive. Many victims were never positively identified due to the state of the remains. Some families never got to bury their loved ones because there wasn't enough recovered for a funeral. They live with absence, with questions, with the knowledge that their loved ones' final moments were horrific beyond imagination. The case demonstrated how sex work criminalization creates danger for vulnerable women. Forced into the shadows, unable to seek police help, working in isolated areas to avoid arrest, these women became easy prey. Advocates used the Pickton case to argue for decriminalization models that prioritize safety over punishment. True crime media has extensively covered Pickton, sometimes exploitatively. The balance between public education and respectful treatment of victims remains contested. Some families appreciate keeping their loved ones' names alive. Others feel traumatized by constant revisiting of their worst tragedy. One lasting question haunts investigators. Was Pickton truly alone? The property hosted hundreds of people through the Piggy Palace parties. The volume of killing and disposal required significant time and effort. Some investigators believe accomplices existed, but evidence was insufficient for charges. David Pickton's exact knowledge and involvement remains disputed. The Commission of Inquiry's final report identified 50 institutional failures that allowed Pickton to operate for so long. 50 distinct points where different choices by police, prosecutors, social services, or civic leaders could have stopped him sooner. The report makes clear these deaths weren't inevitable. They were preventable tragedies enabled by systemic negligence. What do you think drove Robert Pickton to commit such systematic evil? Was it pure sadism or something more complex in the psychology of a man who'd been isolated and marginalized his entire life? Leave your theories in the comments below. The Pickton case reminds us that society's most vulnerable deserve protection, investigation, and justice equal to anyone else. When we fail to value all lives equally, we create opportunities for predators to exploit the marginalized with impunity. If you found this investigation valuable, subscribe to Fear Sermon for more deep dives into history's darkest chapters. We examine not just the crimes, but the systemic failures that enabled them, and the lessons we must learn to prevent future tragedies. Share this video with others who appreciate thorough true crime analysis. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. And remember, the women who died on that farm were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends. They deserved better from the society that failed to protect them. See you in the next video, where we'll continue uncovering the stories that history tried to forget.